We all know the dangers. We all know the potential catastrophe. We now have to do something about it.
An understanding of climate change and the science behind it can help open doors. Kids sort of see this as a challenge of the future, and I think it might sort of encourage more kids to get into science, to take on the challenge.
One of the greatest challenges that we face, and our younger generation are going to have to deal with this, finding solutions. I'm an optimist, but I also firmly believe science and technology are at the heart of our solutions.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's virtual event, the latest edition in the Science Museum Group's Global Climate Talk series. I'm Julia Knights, Deputy Director of the Science Museum in London, and I'd like to start by thanking you all for tuning in to tonight's discussion. Our Climate Talk series has been running since 2021 and has so far welcomed over 70 international speakers from countries across the globe, including Kenya, Kiribati, Uganda, USA and Nicaragua, and returned last month with a discussion on the impact of climate change on food security. And tonight's discussion focuses on the opportunities and challenges faced by India in its ambitions to urbanise large parts of the country, connecting more of its population to electricity and maintain its plan to achieve net zero by 2070. One of the most talked about outcomes of the COP28 climate summit at the end of 2023 was the global commitment to transition away from fossil fuels towards the upscaling of renewables to power our world. For India, a country which has connected 50 million people a year to electricity over the past decade, but not without heavy reliance on coal and oil, this presents a significant challenge. Exactly how this challenge is overcome will depend on ambitions and innovative technological, economic, nature-based and logistical solutions. And to examine the subject, we have assembled an expert panel. I'm delighted to now hand over to your chair for this evening, Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC presenter and correspondent based in London, and formerly a foreign correspondent for the BBC based in Asia and North America. Rajini, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and welcome to our panel and to all of you watching this virtual event. Now, this is the latest, as Julia was saying, in the Science Museum's Climate Talks. It's back for the first time, this series, since 2021. So, as I was saying, I'm delighted that I have a great panel with me to go through various issues, and we're focusing on India. As Julia was saying, it's a country that I have reported from in the past as well and looked at some of those climate issues firsthand, and we're going to be discussing those issues with the panel who have firsthand experience of some of the challenges that India is facing and the opportunities as well. Country, of course, of 1.4 billion people, and a country which is determined to reach net zero at the same time as balancing the challenge of being the world's most populous nation and having a growing economy. Now, as Julia was saying there, it's India's economic and industrial growth over the past few decades, which of course has been noted around the world, and it is staggering. But of course, that is a challenge. How do you balance that growth with ensuring that emissions come down and that India is, like many other countries in the world, balancing those climate challenges? Now, at COP26 in Glasgow back in 2021, India did announce a net zero target of trying to reach net zero by 2070 and intended to reduce 50% of its energy down to renewable sources by 2030. It's made great strides, as we know, in terms of increasing its solar energy reliance and other ways of trying to transition to a more renewable capacity. But of course, as we've been saying in this introduction, it remains a huge challenge, and that's something we're going to be exploring with our panelists. India is a country which still relies heavily on coal. Around 70% or so of its energy is derived from coal. And so, as we're saying, it's going to be not just a challenging transition, but also a costly one. So, the question we'll be discussing and exploring over the next hour or so is whether India can reach its targets. How will it get there? How will that be funded? And how will all of this, as we've been saying, be balanced with India's challenge of a growing economy and a population of something like 1.4 billion people? Well, without further ado, let's introduce the panel of experts who are joining me this evening. In no particular order, I might say. I'm joined by Gauri Jauhar, the Executive Director of Energy Transitions and Clean Tech Consulting at Standard & Poor's Global Commodity Insights. Now, in case you're wondering why Gary's not moving on the screen, unfortunately, Gary's not feeling too well today, so you'll have to do with her voice and a still image so you can see what she looks like. But we're very grateful that Gary has pushed through, not feeling too well, and is able to join us. So thank you very much, Gary. If you want to just say a very quick hello before I then move on to introduce Aun, just so we can hear your voice.
Hello, Rajini. Very nice to be here with you and the panel, and thanks to the Science Museum to invite me and S&P Global Commodity Insights for this.
Lovely. Well, there you go. So Gauri is on the line. I also want to welcome Aun Abdullah, the head of ESG at the Lodha Group, which was recently recognised by the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark as, and I quote, a global sector leader in residential development. And they're developing the Palava city, which is designed to have minimal environmental impact. We're going to be obviously discussing and exploring and explaining what exactly that means. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Abdullah, and also say good evening to you.
Hello,
And
Rajini,
last but
good evening. Thanks for having me.
And last but by no means least, I'm also joined by Mr. Amitabh Kant, who was India's G20 Sherpa when India held the presidency and hosted the G20 summit last September. He's obviously as well, many of you will know, formerly the chief executive of NITI Aayog, the National Institution for Transforming India, a public policy think tank of the Indian government. And we're happy to say that all three of the panelists are with us because we weren't expecting to have Mr. Kant this early in the discussion. So welcome to you as well. Thank you very much for joining us if you also want to say hello to everyone.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Wonderful being here.
And I should just also say it's very late in India. It's 5.5 hours ahead of us in London. So another sort of vote of appreciation for the panel for staying up so late so we can have this discussion. And just also want to stress that this is a completely independent discussion. It's independent from the Science Museum or any of its sponsors. We're here to just have a free and challenging and probing and hopefully a fruitful discussion about some of India's challenges. So welcome to everyone, and we will also then open it up to some questions and a broader discussion as well. And I wanted to first of all, though, bring you all in very briefly to reflect on the recent COP summits. The last one, of course, in Dubai, COP28. But one of the more significant ones, of course, I think for India and making some of the pledges and goals was, of course, the COP summit in Glasgow as well. Let's start with you, Mr. Kant, just very briefly. How do you feel India did at the most recent COP summit, or even if you want to reflect back on Glasgow? And where does that leave India in terms of where it is with its climate goals?
Well, let me put it in a perspective, and I would say that the COP28 conference was a set of mixed outcomes with both some encouraging and disappointing aspects. Encouraging was the operationalization and the capitalization of the loss and damage fund, the tripling of global installed capacity of renewable energy, and the doubling of annual improvements in energy efficiency, which was embedded in the G20 presidency and was one of those outcomes which was taken forward. And probably the establishment of a framework for the global goal on adaptation, and also the commitment to the loss and damage fund with about 800 million in funding pledges, and these are only pledges. But the disappointing outcome, I would say, was insufficient financial provision for the climate adaptation. There was lack of sufficient climate finance mobilization from global north to global south, and the global south's disappointment over the global stocktake draft, which did not accelerate climate action in the short term. And I would say that in my view, it did not meet the expectation of many climate, uh, ambition, particularly in terms of galvanizing more ambitious climate action in the immediate term.
Okay, that's an interesting and a mixed perspective there. And perhaps we'll come back and discuss some of these issues about climate financing and climate adaptability as well. Gauri, let me ask you for your take then on exactly the same issue, which is COP28, or if you want to widen it back to other recent COP summits.
Sure. So I think keeping the focus on COP28, I think the fact that there was a recognition of the move away from the transition away from fossil fuels, that was important. So there was a global consensus of that. There was pledging to triple the renewable energy capacity by 2030 and doubling the rate of energy efficiency, which was also good. But although the pledge does not require any individual country to triple its own renewable capacity, the objective is global and collective. And I think that collective agreement was very important. However, many major markets, we believe, have a very slim chance to actually triple their current capacity even before 2035. With the EU and Latin America, for instance, stretching into the 2040s even. So it is going to be a stretch, because if you look at markets even globally, while renewable capacity grew remarkably over the past 5 years with an annual growth rate of about 16%, uh, to fulfill this tripling pledge, the growth rate has to be about 17%. And that will be quite a challenge because markets have their own different advantages and challenges to building more renewables. So the fact that you have more renewables today makes it harder to build more. Accessibility to funds, as Mr. Kant also mentioned, public funds and private capital is still challenged to come even into renewables. Um, I think the one other thing which was encouraging was the recognition of the ecosystem approach in the global stocktake. There have been recent studies which have talked about how out of the 9 planetary boundaries, we have already breached 6 of them, and 3 are still at a point where there could be some remedies. So I think the fact that the ecosystem approach, the multi-sector approach, was brought in the discussion was important. And India's leadership, of course, was certain. I think India was a prominent voice at the COP28, including the novel approach to national level cap and trade systems, co-launching the second phase of the leadership group for industry transition, Lead IT 2.0. And this came on the back of the success of the G20, where the Global Biofuels Alliance was launched. And there have been initiatives in the form of high level principles on green hydrogen and circular economy via Mission Life. So I think India's voice was quite central to these discussions, which was noteworthy.
Okay, thank you very much, Gauri. Let's bring in Aun Abdullah for your take on the COP summit.
Yes, I second what Mr. Amitabh Kant and Gauri said. But there is always more to wish for. See, uh, you don't control road accidents just by having a strong vehicle insurance regulation and identifying all the fast cars that the young people drive. You also need to have a scheme of good driving schools and a very robust and foolproof licensing mechanism. Now, in this case, you can say that the vehicle insurance program is the loss and damage fund, and the fast cars are the fossil fuels. But where is the behavior change, and where is the development templates? So that is something that needed to be focused upon. And regarding those licensing mechanisms, I think it's exactly the development of supply chains, especially that foster innovation and technological collaboration. Those type of things are generally not touched. As against that, if you see G20 and the Green Development Pact, that is quite comprehensive. It covers resilience, energy transition, uh, as well as the lifestyle for environment. So we need COPs to actually become more comprehensive. So that's, I think, is the need from the forthcoming COPs.
Okay, thank you very much to all of our panelists. Now, we will open this up to a more wider discussion between the panelists, but I'm just going to have brief conversations with each of the panelists just to find out a little bit more, so you as viewers understand a bit more about what they do and how they fit in to this wider climate challenge that India faces. And also, it's a climate opportunity as well. So we'll break it down on both of those fronts. Let's start with Gauri first. Gauri, if you could just tell our audience exactly what you do, first of all, and then we can take it from there.
Sure. Rajini, I lead our consulting and research. I'm a co-head for research in India, and also our India team. We're about 15,000 people in India. We work across the globe on projects. We work in partnership with the Indian government agencies. Have worked with Mr. Kant in the past, and other regulatory and ministry bodies here. We also work in partnership with strategic entities like the US India Strategic Partnership Forum, a certain collaboration they have on the Climate Technologies Action Group side with the US Trade and Development Agency. Um, in terms of themes, we look at energy transitions and policy development, energy pricing and market entry strategies, benchmarking, and the role of ESG in the energy transition, and then drive board level engagements to really bring about change and integration of sustainable fuels in the energy spectrum.
Okay, thank you very much. So, one of the things that we can kick off with, perhaps, given your insights and the work that your organization does and the data it compiles and collates, is actually look a little bit more broadly at some of the challenges that India faces at the beginning. And then, as I say, the opportunities. So, let's start with some of the challenges. When we look at India's emissions, everyone talks a lot about coal. We will discuss that. But if you could break down where India's emissions are sort of driven by, what sectors, and it's interesting because I remember a couple of years ago doing a story about cement and concrete and about how a company in southern India was trying to be more energy efficient when it came to that, because that's another fairly significant contributor to carbon emissions in India, I understand. So, if you could start by just breaking down some of these sectors
Mhm.
that contribute to India's carbon jigsaw, I suppose you could call it.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think the challenge here is really reduction in emissions. And when we talk about an energy transition, what we're really talking about is an emissions transition that needs to happen. So we find that power generation, industry, and transport together account for about 82% of India's energy related emissions. Out of this, when we look at power, we are seeing renewables as the cornerstone of India's climate ambition and climate action. We are seeing renewables. India is the fourth largest renewables market in the world. In transport, we are seeing the push towards electric vehicles, but the challenge of the grid moving away from a largely coal grid still does remain in terms of generation, even though capacity wise, coal is 50%, generation wise, coal is about 74% of the grid still. I think what is the most challenging part of this industry, of this emissions picture, is industry. Because in industry, you're looking at emissions which are not just related to energy emissions, but which are also related to heat and process emissions, industrial process emissions. And those are the ones which are harder to abate. Those are the ones where the technology is yet to come of age. There are technology solutions like hydrogen and carbon capture, which are being looked at both in India and globally. But the cost curves of those, the maturity of those technologies is still not there yet, even globally, for India to develop or and potentially access some of those technologies. But having said that, I think a lot has been done on the power side, a lot is being done on transport. But industry will be the real, I think, the one which will get us to 2070, the final
Okay, thank you
ambition
very
of NITI.
much. Thank you very much, Gauri. I'm sort of going to go off script, if I may, because I would like to get both Amitabh Kant and Aun Abdullah's thoughts on that bigger picture while Gauri has just mentioned it. So let me start with you, Mr. Kant, if I may. The challenge is that India is a growing economy and it is the world's most populous nation. And I visited places in India's coal belt in Jharkhand who say that they are still reliant on coal. They say coal is their life. India can't live without coal. I remember someone telling me it still employs a huge number of people, particularly in the northeast of the country. But the other challenge as well is that it's a growing economy. There are people who still want to get on the electric grid. They want electrification of more villages and more rural areas, which is going to drive up the emissions on that front.
So let me first say that India has made remarkable achievements in growing its renewable energy program. And the country is the only G20 country which has overachieved its commitment made at COP21 in Paris. It's already meeting 40% of its power capacity from non fossil fuels, almost 9 years ahead of its commitment. India's installed renewable energy capacity stands at about 187 gigawatts, and that's really remarkable. Our
Which, of course, we will be
non-fossil fuel.
discussing. We will be discussing that, Mr. Kant, the opportunities and what India is doing. I just want to look at the issue that Gauri said, which is some 80%. Of these emissions are related to industry, and we will, of course, absolutely discuss some of the work that India is doing around renewables. But just to focus on the challenges that still exist.
So the challenge is that even if India was to do 100% of its electricity as renewable, it will only be 20% of the energy. The 80% is what is known as the hard to abate sectors: steel, cement, fertilizer, refinery, long distance transport. The answer to that lies in using renewable to crack water and produce green hydrogen. And that India's pushed for the green hydrogen mission in a very big way. Instead of being we import worth about 180 billion worth of fossil fuel. India's ambition is that by the time it becomes 100 in 2047, it should be, instead of being an importer, it should be an exporter of energy. And that means that we should be able to bring down the cost of green hydrogen from $5 a kilogram to about $1 a kilogram. India's ambition, and it's really pushing for it in a big way. Every single corporate is now pushing for it in a big way. That with size and scale, India should be the biggest producer of green hydrogen, and climatic conditions bless it to be able to do it. It should be actually the biggest exporter of green hydrogen in its liquid form, ammonia, and it should be the biggest manufacturer of electrolyzer. And to my mind, the speed with which India is pushing for this ambition, it's ambitious, but it's a doable target for India. And India's this would also mean that we should sharply bring down the cost of renewable with size and scale, and that is what India is working towards.
Let me bring in, thank you, Mr. Kant. Let me bring Aun Abdullah just on this point, which is, of course, that challenge that Gauri spelt out and the reliance that India has on highly polluting forms of industry. As Mr. Kant outlined there, it's not just electricity, but it's some of those steel plants, coal, of course. Some 70% of energy use in India is still, derived from coal. And I wanted to talk about concrete actually, and cement as something that I've seen firsthand. You do have companies who are trying to do what they can to make more of that energy efficient. And Mr. Kant talked about green hydrogen, but we're still talking about it being a huge challenge.
See, while it's a challenge, it's also a very huge opportunity for India. If you talk about concrete, ultimately, carbon capture will be an important component in concrete. Steel will be highly impacted by the hydrogen ecosystem, including, as Mr. Amitabh Kant said, long haul transportation and fertilizer and all. The point is that these technologies are high potential future sectors where India can gain advantage over rest of the world. So if we have to grow significantly, we have to grow significantly in these high potential sectors. So this is where we will have to build capacity, and this is where we will have to, go for the leadership. And I think because the time is such where we have to develop in a manner where climate risks are all apparent, while all other countries developed when they were not so. This is the opportunity that India will go for, and I'm sure we will see success in it. On the coal part, I think it's important also to note how the grid factors are also coming down. So what are the grid factors today? But if you look at what they will be in 2030 and what they will be in a decade hence, it's a consistent drop. You also have to see the overall scale at which it is happening. So I think it's going in the positive side or in the positive direction.
Okay, thank you to both of you. Let's go back to uh, Gauri. Gauri, one of the things that I think has sort of come out of the last few COP summits is time. It's going to take time for India to make that transition. There's no doubt, not just from the rest of the panel, but people in government and activists and other groups in India, that there is this desire for this change and this transition. It was meant to be by 2050. Prime Minister Modi's now set the goal of 2070. What trends do Standard & Poor's predict in terms of that timescale being met and how that would be met?
Sure. So I think the economic transition is driven largely by the economic reforms and transition. So India's short and medium term economic growth, which is India is the fastest growing major economy in the world in our forecast period into the medium term and possibly the long term. So it will be driven by economic reforms and significant investments in infrastructure. And economic and energy transitions will coincide. In fact, the economic transition will, in a sense, drive the energy transition and will also dictate some of the energy choices. So when we look at like key economic variables of where we live, how reliable our lives become. So key economic variables of mobility, urbanization, the desire for reliability, all these will positively impact the energy transition. And the dependence on fossil fuels will reduce over time. I think what needs to be watched out is that how do local climate change effects, such as air pollution, heat waves, floods, how will they challenge the pace and quality of this transition? What we do see in our forecasts is that it's around the mid 2030s when India will experience certain economic and energy inflection points. And the energy transition will also be a technology transition because those it'll be certain technologies in the short term, medium term, long term, which will impact the emissions transition. So in the short term, we believe India will totally exhaust the options on energy efficiency and renewables build out, which will be literally foundational to India's energy transition. In the medium
Okay.
term, we see hydrogen and carbon capture and utilization and storage delivering material emission outcomes for those hard to abate sectors, which we discussed before. And government policies will be very key to this to build those new supply chains of clean technologies, whether it is the manufacturing of PV modules, batteries, electrolyzers in India.
Okay, thank you very much, Gauri. Well, let's move on to have a little bit of a discussion with Aun Abdullah. Um, Aun, you work for Lodha Group. Tell us about what we discussed there earlier in your introduction, which is your smart city. What is a smart city? And tell us about Palava, the specific smart city that you're behind.
So Palava is our flagship city development. It was conceptualized, a decade and a half back, uh, basically to get over the problem of the livability and quality issues that you have in any typical city, the traffic congestion, and also the fact that people don't care about the commons. So we took a multi-decade, multi-generational view as to how can we develop a greenfield city which tackles these problems, because this will be paramount when India urbanizes. So as of now, there is a population of close to 200,000 in Palava, and at the ultimate build out, more than a million people will live and work there.
And where
Uh,
exactly is it in
so
India?
it's next to the economic nucleus that we call as Mumbai, and it's and you actually need an economic nucleus. So and that's why it is next to Mumbai, and we are building it with high livability standards and sustainability, especially in context of climate. It's a smart city. It's built on the concept of walkability, so 5, 10, 15 principle, so that you can walk to your needs, daily needs in 5 minutes, and more in 15, and an inclusive city governance mechanism where city councils help to govern the city and take care of the commons. Now, this because it's a greenfield city, we could do a lot. Uh, it's a The whole city is oriented right, and large green spaces are interspersed in the master plan in a way that the city is 1.5 degrees cooler than what it was before uh, the development. Uh, the homes are built with natural ventilation and daylighting, yet they are fitted with the best in class air conditioning and adaptation thing. Uh, Most of
Air
the equipment
conditioning, which of
is
course does use a lot of energy.
yes, so they are the best in class in energy efficiency. Uh, and then roughly 10% of the city runs on the electricity needs come from renewable energy, which
So
will become
solar, is that?
25% very soon. Yes, solar. Uh, and ultimately, a complete renewable transition will also happen, which we are already working on. The city treats 100% of the wastewater and reuses it. uh, all the homes are fitted with low flow water fixtures. But on resilience, we have moved a bit ahead. I mean, I think we are the only people who have started working with global climate models, running them on IPCC scenarios to generate synthetic weather data of the future that can be used instead of the traditional use of historic data, which is not representative of the future. So it's a city where all aspects of resilience and decarbonization are taken care of, plus obviously the use of technology and inclusive governance.
So it's kind of a utopia, not just for India, but actually many countries around the world. One question I think a lot of people watching this would ask, though, is this only for people of a certain wealth group? And, given that India is a huge and diversely economic country, are there a lot of people that this would just be completely out of reach of in the first place?
No, Palava is because it is a city, it has to be affordable. It's just not a premium development. It is an affordable development where everyone can. So the idea is, how can an affordable city be premium? So that's the whole thing. And the city teaches us as to what we can incorporate in rest of our developments. Plus, we are also offering it as a template for anybody to follow. So you can assume that it is a collaborative venture. And now with we have something called Lodha Net Zero Urban Accelerator. We are trying to pass all these learnings to everybody, where they can even use it as it is, or tweak them as per their demands, and create a model of urbanization which really proves that growth can be decoupled from emissions.
Apologies for losing the feed for a moment, but I am still with Aun Abdullah from Lodha Group, and we are talking about their Palava Smart City, which is in many ways a sort of utopian green city. And the question I was just asking you before we lost the signal was, how much could this be a model not just for the rest of India, but the rest of the world in terms of this sort of utopian green city?
So at least for the climatic zone that it is in, it can simply be copied. But there are aspects of urbanization which are captured here, which can actually be used in the entire world. Uh, the the point is, if you look at India, there are reports which suggest that 100 million households will become home ownership capable, and in next 10 years, and all of this urbanization will happen just all over the place. It's a huge number. So it what we are offering as Palava is just a template, and this template can be tweaked depending upon the requirements of the particular region. But it's an integrated template, so that's something that anybody can use.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Aaron. And just tell us about the Net Zero Urban Accelerator that your group is also behind. What exactly is that?
So we have been working with RMI for several years, and Lodha Net Zero Urban Accelerator is a platform that we have made in partnership with RMI. You can call it as our innovation arm, where what we are trying to do is to bring industry partners together and try to solve for decarbonizing the built environment. Uh, what we have done here is we have broken down the carbon emissions of the built environment into its component parts, starting from embodied carbon to the demand reduction, supply, as well as green mobility. Green mobility, especially because of the city context. What we do here is we have baselined the whole city, and then we identify initiatives which we can pilot and scale. The idea is to co-develop these solutions with the industry, test them on the ground, give them the feedback, achieve success in the pilot, and then scale up. I can, give you a couple of examples. If we recently built a couple of buildings with a greener concrete mix with much higher usage of GGBS, slag, basically. Now, it could overcome the complexities which are associated with it, and now we can scale it up across the portfolio. Same we are trying with the recently uh, announced LC3 cement. So we are about to do a pilot with that. We are trying to do some 3D printing to see how we can scale that up. So that's on the embodied carbon side. Similarly, you were talking about the AC. So the AC that we have at Palava is already best in class. But there was something called Global Cooling Prize conducted by RMI, where the manufacturers were called upon to create a concept unit which performs 5 times better than the best in class. So now those units are being field tested at Palava. The idea is to compare that performance with the actual usage, and then maybe put our demand on the table to make them commercially viable. So how can we do things which transform the market and make the solutions scalable? That's the idea with the accelerator, and that's why the word accelerator. We want to really push. It's the speed and scale. So we will do what we can, and the accelerator also intends to do call to industry to gather the demand, give right demand signals in the industry, and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much, Aun Abdullah. We're going to move on now, just because we are already eating through our time. But let's bring in Amitabh Kant, who, as I mentioned earlier, was India's G20 Sherpa during India's presidency of the G20, which, of course, culminated in that summit in New Delhi last September. There's lots of things we could ask you, of course. One thing I wanted to ask you before we look at what's being done and what the government's sort of perspective on all of this is, because we haven't touched it yet in this discussion, is how India isn't just, one of the countries that is looking at how it can reduce its emissions, but it's also at the front line of climate change because of flooding and other unseasonal weather. And that's a big kind of part of the equation here as well, isn't
Yeah. So can I respond to that?
it? Yes, yes.
Uh, so, uh, you know, uh, uh, as I had mentioned, we've taken a series of measures, and the challenge for India is really to be the first country in the world to industrialize and urbanize uh, with decarbonization. And we are not responsible for occupying carbon space. If you look at the total carbon space available, uh, 82% of it has been occupied by the developed world. But irrespective of that, while we are on a per capita income basis entitled to 17.5%, and we've just taken 3.5% of it. But irrespective of that, India must really push. Our political leadership feels that India must really take the lead as far as climate action is concerned. And that is why we are the only G20 country which has accelerated renewables, meeting 40% of its power capacity from non fossil fuel. We've pushed for green hydrogen, we've pushed for electric mobility. We are now pushing for solar rooftop in a big way. And India's achievements in renewable energy and now in green hydrogen are a very, very significant contribution to the global fight against climate change. And they actually serve as a model for many of the developed world today. Because what India is trying to achieve has never happened before in the history. And that is that between peaking and net zero, while the developed world and the Western countries took 70 to 80 years, we are trying to achieve net zero from peaking period in about 25 to 30 years time. And this, to my mind, is shows a lot of determination to fight climate change and take very ambitious climate action.
And that's a very important point. I've spoken to people in India who have said to me, why can't I have two cars when someone in America has two cars on their drive? I remember a while back now speaking to somebody who owned a factory in Bombay who said, well, the reason why I pollute in this factory is because I'm making shoes that are then sent back to the UK. So, I mean, everybody on this panel seems to agree that India does need to do something, but there are some people in the country who say, well, why should India set the same standards as the West, who has been allowed to grow and develop economically? What would you say to that, Mr. Kant?
So, I think the important thing is to encourage behavioral change. We should not make the mistakes which the Western part of the world has already done by urbanizing for cars and not for people. And our jobs in most developing countries should be to encourage behavioral change, which is crucial for achieving green transition. And that is why Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, has repeatedly spoken about citizens becoming pro planet people and talked about the lifestyle for environment, which was adopted by G20 in 23. It recognizes the importance of changing behavior to address climate change. It's not countries which are going to make a difference, it's going to be individual citizens who are going to make a difference. And according to IA, if you look at International Energy Authority, Measures targeted by life would actually reduce annual CO2 emission by more than 2 billion tons. And this is about one fifth, 20% of the reductions needed by 2030 to put the world on a pathway to net zero emissions. And therefore, we are great believers that nudging citizens, behavioral change tools are increasingly have to be used to encourage a reduction in household energy. This needs to be done both by developing countries, but more significantly and more importantly by the developed world. And the behavioral interventions are more efficient when combined with other instruments such as regulatory or structural reforms. And that is why we believe that life mission is very critical.
Let's talk about some of the other things that India is doing before we may perhaps return to the challenges. I mean, solar is seen as a huge opportunity, for example, isn't it, in India? Just tell us how much progress has been made on that. I seem to remember, is it Delhi's metro runs entirely on solar power, correct?
Yeah, so last year we moved about 8 billion people on our railways, which is the entire population on the planet moved on Indian railways. And Indian Railway will be totally electric by 2030. And as I've repeatedly said, that meeting 40% of its power capacity from non-fossil fuel is a remarkable achievement. To achieve 187 gigawatt at low cost is our objective. Is that we should be able to make renewable far cheaper than what coal can ever do, and therefore by sheer economic compulsion, we should citizens will go in for renewable. Our non-fossil fuel capacity has significantly grown over the past 9 years. It's our solar capacity has seen a remarkable rise, skyrocketing by over 25-fold from 2.63 gigawatt in 2014 to about 73 gigawatt now. And we are fourth in wind power capacity and fifth in solar power capacity globally. I talked about the big push for electric mobility, and our target is by 2030, all two-wheelers, three-wheelers must go electric. India's just done the biggest procurement of electric buses, 5,500 buses, and the next procurement is going to be 10,000 buses. In the next 3 years, we'll be procuring 100,000 buses, which will all be electrical. And India's renewable electricity is growing at a faster rate than any other major economy in the world, with new capacity additions on track to double by 2026. And therefore, we are pushing to ensure that sheer economically by size and scale, we should bring down the cost of renewable wind, green hydrogen. We should use our size and scale of India to bring demand for non-fossil fuels to such low levels that we should not only be a domestic consumer, but an exporter of energy.
So it's all about economics. I should say, I think it's 60% of Delhi Metro which relies on solar. I got my numbers a little bit out there, but it's still a commendable percentage of the energy for a metro system. There is a challenge. I know we come back to it, but it is important to address it again, which is that not only is India reliant on coal for about 70% of its energy at the moment, even if there's a will, of course, to get that down and make it more affordable to go to alternatives, but India is also adding coal at the same time. Something like nearly 3 gigawatts of coal-fired generation is going to be added. So I think some critics would say, well, why is India even doing that?
That's you look around the world. The answer lies in the fact that India's energy demand is going to rise. It's going to be citizens are going to get into urban areas. Electricity has to be made available to the citizens of India, and therefore our task is really that you should not be mandating. You should ensure that the price of solar, wind, non-fossil fuel falls, and people go in for that. And that's the way the world will grow. It'll go through green hydrogen. It'll go through battery storage and renewable energy. It'll grow through small modular reactors. On all this, prices have to fall. But the post-COVID era has seen Germany is reviving. Germany has revived all its coal plants. We haven't done that. UK has given 150 new licenses in for fossil fuel exploration. We haven't done that. Our task has been really to push for uh, solar and renewables in as big a way as possible to ensure that in the next 5 decades should be able to meet the energy requirement of the 500 million people getting into this process through non-fossil fuel energy and bring the costings down as much as possible, and to ensure that India must urbanize and manufacture and become a leading nation of the world through a deep process of decarbonization which has never before happened in the world.
I want to pick up on a point that you raised there about other parts of the world not yet meeting their commitments, particularly Western nations who continue to use and rely on fossil fuels as well. It goes back to what some people on the street say, which is, why is India being held to that standard? And should India be expected to decarbonise at the pace that it's doing?
Well, India should do this as a responsible country because it has responsible political leadership. If 90% of the carbon space has already been occupied, there's very little left. Out of 2,800 gigaton, 2,400 gigaton has already been occupied by the developed world. They still continue to go around opening up fossil fuel operations, both in high seas as well as through coal. But India feels responsible that it's going to be the third most polluting country. At the speed at which it is growing, the greenhouse gas emissions will be high. So it must push for electric mobility. It must push for renewables. It must ensure a better life for its citizens. It must ensure that there is responsible lifestyle for environment. It believes that development and sustainability are both compatible. It strongly believes that in today's world, you'll add value, you'll attract capital by being sustainable, and therefore India is pushing for it. And India believes that many of these new initiatives, like what was talked about, the Lodha smart city, are crucial for achieving a green urban transition in India. We are believers that the new process of urbanization has to be based on cycling and walking. It has to be based on public transportation and not on cars. We will use technology solutions. We will use technology to leapfrog, and we ensure that India to transition to net zero and
Thank you very much
become
for
a
your
global
thoughts.
leader in all emerging technologies.
Okay, thank you. I had a bit of a problem hearing you just there. Thank you very much, Mr. Amitabh Kant. Let's bring in the rest of the panel to broaden our discussion and bring everyone in again. We sort of looked at everyone's specialist areas there. The one thing I wanted to ask you all, I touched upon it a little bit with all of you, is how India's also been front of some of these climate disasters, unseasonal floods, droughts as well. I remember being in Chennai a few years ago, one of India's largest cities, when it was in the midst of a terrible drought. Um, Gauri, how much is India also really at the receiving end of a lot of these climate disasters, and how much does that cost India as well? And how much does that therefore mean the world needs to be more needful when it comes to, everybody talked about at the beginning, loss and damage?
Right, right. So I think it's a great question because investments in climate adaptation is what is really lacking. We already have a problem in climate finance on mitigation, that not enough money is going to mitigation, but even lesser money is actually going into adaptation. And I think the numbers are that less than 10% of climate finance actually goes into adaptation. And we have recently looked at how marginal increases in temperature have huge climate hazards, and those climate hazards are actually having far greater impacts in lower income countries, lower middle income countries, countries in South Asia like India, as opposed to some of the upper income countries. So we've done some recent analysis on how the focus on adaptation needs to be far more than it has been so far, and I think that is where you know GDPs get impacted. GDP has a huge variability linked to those needs for adaptation being met. So I think much more climate resilient infrastructure needs to be built, and some of the description which on shared before about the Lodha development is a very encouraging sign.
Oh, let's bring you in on that point that we look at resilience, I mean, that still is how a lot of people in India, particularly in low-lying coastal areas, relate to the climate emergency in their eyes because they're living it.
Yeah, so the physical climate risks are definitely, very critical for large segments of Indian population, which is quite vulnerable. Uh, but here I would like to add context that we need to really understand that what that risk is. And as I was telling that we have started using global climate models and running them on IPCC scenarios, I think that's a way of finding the challenge at each local cluster. Uh, Sometimes we overgeneralize the problem, but I think this needs to be tackled at a local level. And then, depending on the actual risk, we need to take those interventions. One, obviously, retrofitting and uh, managing a post-event situation is very difficult. So it's very important to build it right the first time. Now, the advantage with India is that since we will be building so much in the coming decade, if we can become conscious of how to integrate these adaptive measures and understand the real physical climate risk and do our designs and developments accordingly, I think the impact will be significantly cushioned.
Okay, thank you. Amitabh Kant, what does India need more funding specifically for? You talked at the beginning about more money for loss and damage and climate resilience. What specifically does India want to spend that?
So let me first say that, in response to your earlier question, that over 40 Indian cities are among the world's most vulnerable to climate and environmental threats. And this highlights the need for urgent action to safeguard these urban centers. And, it's the critical role of coastal and urban areas in India's economic growth is very, very important. And investing in early warning systems and disaster risk resilience is really crucial for these coastal states. And to my mind, on the financial issue, the fight against climate change requires both a collaborative and a cooperative approach. And we need to actually embrace very innovative solutions and financing mechanisms. It can't be done by international institutions. It requires a lot of private capital to move in, and that means the multiplier impact of that will be enormous. And multilateral financial institutions, as the G20 had pointed out, these are outdated institutions which were made in the post World War II era. In the post Bretton Woods period, they need to be redesigned and restructured to mobilize much more of private capital. India's path to resilience actually involves tapping into both domestic and international capital. And we prioritize nature-based solutions. We ensure community involvement at all levels, and we believe that by focusing on climate proofing infrastructure and enhancing access to finance and technology, India can build a sustainable and resilient future for its urban centers, and we will be able to safeguard the well being of our people.
Thank you. I wonder which, maybe it's staying with you, Mr. Kant. One thing that I found quite interesting is some of the work that's been done in a state like Orissa in terms of climate resilience. And actually, now when those storms happen in Orissa and indeed in parts of Bangladesh, you find that the death toll is thankfully quite low. Because the systems there, having worked with the World Bank and other organizations as well, are really models for many other parts of the world. I wonder if you could just tell our viewers a little bit about the systems in Orissa, for example, flood warnings and those kind of things, and moving people to shelters as well, just to highlight one area where a lot of work's been done.
So I think remarkable work has been done in Orissa. It's absolutely unprecedented. And investing in early warning system and disaster risk resilience has been crucial, given the very high vulnerability of Orissa. An effective early warning system, it is demonstrated, can significantly reduce the damage and the loss of lives from such events. And actually, Orissa has ensured that despite several calamities, lives have not been lost. And actually, uh, it has demonstrated that it offers a very high return on investment early warning systems if you invest in it. And the experience of disaster related losses and fatalities have been very, very low. And the experience of countries like Bangladesh and example of Orissa actually demonstrates that where cyclone related mortality can be reduced dramatically, decreased due to effective early warning system. And I think it demonstrates the need for good technology. It demonstrates the need for community-based disaster preparedness programs, and these are important measures for all coastal states in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. We've discussed a little bit of this earlier, but what do you think about the goal of 2070 for net zero? Why do you think India can make that commitment become a reality? And what issues do you think might slow it down and might mean that it doesn't?
So I think India will achieve that. And
Please go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to bring Aun in just briefly, Mr. Kant.
Oh, sure.
so I think India will achieve that. And the hypothesis is, as I already said, that the climate tech sectors are high potential, high productivity, high value sectors in the years to come. And if India takes a approach of achieving global lead in that, then we will not only become from a low mid income economy to a high income economy as we aspire to be to do in the Amrit Kal. We actually implement these things also at scale then. So if India has to succeed in the Amrit Kal goal, then India will succeed in the clean tech leadership goal, and then therefore India will become net zero by 2070 or even earlier. So it's all lining up. And if we have to bring so many people out of poverty, increase the productivity significantly, I think this whole sector will remain in absolute focus in the coming decades, and it will definitely happen.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions, and just before we run out of time, I would like to get to at least one of them that was sent in by Lucy. Lucy, I'm hoping that you're watching this as well. Thank you very much for your question. Lucy asks, how big of a problem are methane emissions from Delhi's rubbish dumps, and how can the problem be solved? I'm going to start with you, Gauri, but I'm going to ask all of you your thoughts on that question since it's come from a viewer.
Sure. I mean, methane emissions is a near-term challenge. I think it's a challenge which is a wide-ranging challenge based on waste dumps, but also on oil and gas production activities. And the good news about methane abatement, though, is that it is, when we look at the whole bouquet of technologies in the near term, in the medium term, in the long term, um, you know, m- there are, in India is a signatory, and companies like ONGC and service providers have technologies to work on methane abatement in the very near term. So the challenge is something which is quite achievable. I would put methane abatement in the same category of abatement which can happen in the near term, like energy efficiency and renewables. So energy efficiency, renewables, and methane abatement, there are proven technologies that can be utilized to reduce the burden of methane emissions. So it is not something where, like hydrogen and CCUS, we have to come down a whole cost curve, a whole technology maturation curve. We do have the technologies at hand, and it's about deployment at this point.
Thanks, Gauri. Mr. Kant, I wonder if you wanted to pick up on that question, Lucy, as well.
No, I think Gary has responded to that. I think we can cover some other areas as well.
Okay, we've got a question from Will just before we wrap up. Let's put that one to you then. Will asks, if the panel seen any examples might have a positive impact on India moving towards a low carbon future?
No, there are great examples of a large number of startups doing path-breaking work in electric mobility. What you're seeing is a huge movement of young entrepreneurs. There's a massive level of disruption taking place in battery storage, in electric mobility, in microgrids. And India is actually serving as a unique example for the world in demonstrating how to upscale industry, how to urbanize in a sustainable manner, and to build infrastructure sustainably. And we are, in many ways, technologically leapfrogging through innovation. And what it has demonstrated is that what India is demonstrating to the world is that technological solutions could really help India transition to net zero and become a global leader in all areas, whether it's green hydrogen, to become a global lab for green hydrogen production and exports, where we could significantly decarbonize hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, and refineries. It demonstrated its great ability to do battery storage and renewable energy. And actually, India is already one of the world's largest producers of modern bioenergy and has big ambitions to scale up its use across the country. The government is committed to installing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, a huge focus on biofuels as well. And I think the next big move in India you will see will be on, and I can tell you this, that in addition to electrolyzers, there will be a big move for small modular reactors, which to our mind will be the future of nuclear energy because of its adaptability, because of its safety, and because of the economic viability offered by small modular reactors. And these technologies, along with a focus on sustainable finance, low carbon industrial systems, and carbon dioxide removal solutions, will actually help India achieve its net zero goals ahead of even 2070. And this India will demonstrate to the world that it will be the first country to urbanize and manufacture and become a manufacturing nation through a process of decarbonization.
Okay, well, you heard that here first. Let's see what year India does reach that then, if you do feel that it will be sooner than 2070. Let's put that question from Will before we wrap up to Gauri and to Aun. We don't have a huge amount of time, so if you could just perhaps in a minute each, we'll start with you, Aun. Talk about any other low-tech solutions that you have seen that haven't perhaps...
In 10 seconds. So in 10 seconds only, the listener can visit Palava.
Okay,
So
another plug for your...
the full spectrum solutions are there.
Okay, perfect. What about you, Gauri? I mean, we've heard a lot, and I've heard a lot about green hydrogen. That's one buzzword that Mr. Kant has been mentioning a lot. A lot of other people talk about that as real kind of hope. What low-tech solutions, though, do you see in this equation?
So I think energy efficiency is the sort of low tech solution where it's as simple as changing a light bulb to an LED bulb. It's as simple as getting higher efficiency rating equipment like air conditioners. So for instance, another statistic I always look at is that by 2050 India will possibly be a 1 billion air conditioner market. Now, if all those new air conditioners are high efficiency units, you're just saving that much more energy. So I think energy saved is very important.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we do have to wrap up this discussion now, but there's plenty more, of course, that we could have discussed, and it's a hugely complex issue with many layers to it as well. I'm sure that all of you watching at home will agree that it was a stimulating and thought-provoking discussion, which covered a lot of the work that India is doing and hopes to do, as well as some of the challenges and the climate impacts as well. I want to thank all of our speakers for their time and their valuable insights in this discussion. Amitabh Kant, Aun Abdullah, and Gauri. Gauri Jauhar. I don't know why I was calling Gauri Lodha. Gauri Jauhar. I've mixed everyone's names up now. And want to thank everyone for watching this. It will be available on YouTube as well if you want to pick it up and watch it again or send it to anyone else who might find this a fascinating discussion themselves. There is one more talk in this series that is happening on the 29th of February on Thursday. Broadcaster and presenter Samira Ahmed will be joined by an expert panel like this one tonight, examining the issue of the UK's current backlog to connect clean energy projects to the national grid. You can find out more and book a free ticket via the link below. And of course, if you would like to support the Science Museum's group's essential mission to inspire the next generation of scientists, engineers, and innovators, you can find a link to make a donation in the description below the box where you are watching. So once again, I would like to thank all of you for watching, and I would like to thank our speakers once again, Aun Abdullah, Amitabh Kant, and Gauri Jauhar. Gauri, please feel better. We're sorry we couldn't see you in vision for this discussion, and of course, thanks to you all for staying up so late. I'm sure you're desperate to get to bed now, but it was really interesting to get that first-hand insight from the three of you working on the ground as India aims to become net zero by 2070. Thank you very much for watching, all of you. Good evening.